Hallo, hallo.
Hello, Thijs Wil. It's almost like this is not the first time we've done this introduction.
Okay, we're doing a brief improvised introduction to our criticism of a video posted by
Theo Tanchak.
Theo Tanchak. Sorry for butchering the last name. Theo Tanchak, and he made a video where he did a posture analysis of Drew from Stora and why his right foot keeps slipping. But a couple of thoughts, maybe starting with your thoughts, because we both know that once I start talking, I never stop. So maybe a couple of thoughts as to why it could be relevant.
Well, I think as we've talked about before, then the pretty much the very first statement that Theo says is kind of hard not to agree with in some sort of way. And he says Drew's right foot keeps slipping because his center of gravity is all above his left leg, and therefore there's not enough weight to keep the right foot from slipping. And I mean, that seems like a pretty plausible hypothesis. And then we kind of start getting deeper and deeper down into the explanations of why this is happening, and that's kind of where the sort of the chain jumps off for me. And I think, I mean, maybe Theo has a lot of sort of scientific backing for his statements, but he doesn't present it in the video. So I'm left with a lot of questions, which is like, why pretty much. Yes. Why to everything?
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that we're not doing this to kind of like degrade Theo in any way, and he seems to be doing this for a living. But I think if this had just been a video and some people in the comments had written like, okay, then I would probably have been more fine with the video. But I think the lack of critical assessment in the comments from obviously a lot of parkour people who says like, wow, this is really interesting. Can you now do an analysis of this person? Can you now do an analysis of this person? And they're taking, it seems, everything in the video at face value. And that could be a potential problem because that could maybe spread, and then people could start assessing everyone left and right based on very little, because that comes back to what you said. There's very little argumentation for his statements after, well, the first one is broad and vague enough that it doesn't need a lot of argumentation. But from there on, it gets deeper and deeper, like you said. Another guy that's worth mentioning is
James Adams.
James Adams, who is currently studying his master's degree in biomechanics. He made a video criticizing this video and just took a simple aspect of it, and how he said a lot of posture analysis on video, you can get fooled by the perspective of the video, which is not necessarily properly aligned. So it's basically an optic illusion. First of all, whenever you stop a frame and look at people, it is a frame. And he started even with the first statement to support that. He takes a couple of videos of Drew hanging out at different places, and he freezes some of those frames, and then he draws lines and says like, look, you can see here, according to my lines, that Drew is like always leaning to this side. However, I stopped the video in some other places and froze other frames, and there Drew wasn't leaning as much to the right. There he was standing more center or leaning more left. So first of all, I guess the first question is like, how much are you affected by your own confirmation bias? And that's not really addressed. If he said, I'm going to stop this in some frames, and those frames don't show anything, but it seems that like it's explained in a way that those frames become kind of like an example of how Drew always is. Which is basically like saying, look, the other day Oliver was grumpy. Oliver is a grumpy man. No, like he was grumpy like for a few minutes the other day. He's not always fucking grumpy.
I mean, now it just happens that I pretty much am always grumpy, but
yeah, sure.
But if I wasn't, that would be a pretty thin sort of base of evidence that you're basing that exclamation on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Secondly, okay, so then he starts talking about what I called, I think I described it to Flynn as flavor lore, which is basically whenever you put cool scientific terminology or nice sounding descriptions into any of your explanations, people are biased to believe it more. And I think it's worth reading Thinking Fast and Slow if you want to know a bit more about this, which is based on a ton of psychological studies, and we've both read that. But he starts talking about how Drew leans to his right, trying to get that right, leans to his right, and that how that's specifically in the conjunction between his lumbar spine and his thoracic spine. And I feel that's the first statement that's kind of like, we get no explanation on what that is based on. Like, what is that assessment that makes you think that this one specific conjunction in his spine is where that happens? That could probably be a rotation in his pelvis as well, or it could be, but like most postures, it's most likely divided over a bunch of joints. I would first of all ask, where does that idea come from, right? Like, how do you assess with your eyes on videos, on a few select videos, through clothing?
On a few select frames from a few select videos.
Yes. How would you justify making that assessment? And we don't know. So that's a good question to ask. And again, why is that a good question to ask? It's a good question to ask because it seems no one in the comment section had asked this. Everyone's just taking that at face value. And some people said, wow, this is scary. So it brings us to something else that you and I often talk about, like people bringing up a bunch of possible correlations and confusing that with being plausible correlations. And those are not necessarily the same thing. Possible correlations are everywhere, all around us, and very rarely true. Plausible correlations are very hard to find, and there's very few, it seems. I think another reason why this might be a bit of a problem is biomechanics has just, as you and I also talk about a lot in our webinars, like, and amongst ourselves, like biomechanics has been criticized a lot lately also in the world of physiotherapy and sports science, because people are generally, it seems, again and again and again through psychological and other scientific studies, we're just very, very bad at judging things with our eyes on a large scale, at least. Our good friend Lynn tends to remind us that
Flynn Disney.
Yeah, shout out to Flynn Disney. He's good at reminding us that people are fairly good with over time, fairly good at judging kind of like simple short-term situations and assessing those with their intuition. And I think this is maybe exactly where this criticism goes. Like the first statement, again, is fairly simple, and I wouldn't argue against it. But then we go deeper and deeper, and then Theo takes more and more examples. Like, look, here Drew is landing again with the weight to his on his left, and it looks kind of like wobbly. And I'm like, yeah, but most of us, if we bail something, look kind of wobbly. Like if you bail something where your momentum moves in a certain direction, when you place whatever limb you have available down, and it's some sort of bail, you will come down on that limb with unexpected force in a weird direction, and the way you cope will most likely look weird, unless you're lucky and you roll it off very well, right?
Shout out Don Tomato.
So yeah, I think there's generally just too little in the video, at least. And again, we're just talking about what's being presented in the video, not necessarily what Theo himself, how he thinks. There's too little acknowledgement of our ignorance as people and how little we actually know. And again, I would maybe then shout out to Katie Bowman, Adam Meekins, and Jared Hall, who's like one biomechanist and two physiotherapists who lately have talked about a lot of studies and brought forth a lot of studies referred to them where like showing how bad even physiotherapists and skilled experts actually are at assessing anything mechanical in the human body, and how little we are able to repeat findings. Like you have a bunch of people with scoliosis and none of them exhibit the same pain symptoms, or you have a bunch of people who look like that their hips function really badly, but they are great at squatting. And then you have a bunch of people who look as if their hip functions great, but they're terrible at squatting, etc. Like the correlation between the mechanical and the functional is not as direct as we tend to think.
Mm.
And even the video is presented as there's a direct correlation.
Or a direct causation, almost.
Oh, what?
A direct causation.
Yeah, a direct causation, yes. And I just think there's very little evidence for that. And I think that if people throw their lives and well-being into the hands of someone else, or if people take other people's lives and well-being into their hands, then the person taking someone else's lives and well-being into their hands should stay very aware of where their own limitations goes, because you're responsible for someone else. And if you cannot admit to failure, you have a tendency to try and see things through to the end, even to the detriment of other people, because you tend to think you're right. And this is something I'm always worried about. And if you throw your lives into the hands of someone, for example, a posture analyzer,
posture analyst,
a posture analyst, then you should maybe start out with some critical questions and remember that people are human beings who don't really know a lot. Just like all human beings don't know a lot. Period. So you should remember that. And with how much tracking this video is getting, or with how many people are like being interested in it and saying, wow, this is so scary, I see it now, then I'm really worried that this is something that will spread very quickly. And I just don't think there's any basis for that. And I would be super interested in hearing people's thoughts, and also hearing from Theo himself, and hearing from the name of the other guy who I keep forgetting, which is a pity.
James Adams.
James Adams. I want to call him Adam James. James Adams. I guess that's it, right?
That's pretty much it, I think. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, we'll get back to this and stay tuned for more.